Ankur, I have your consent for recording.
Yes, of course, of course.
Okay. A very good morning to everyone present here, and a very warm welcome and happy Makar Sankranti to all the participants. It is indeed a great pleasure and privilege to have Dr. Ankur Madan as our resource person here today. Dr. Ankur Madan and I have worked together in Janki Devi Memorial College many, many years ago. So it's a special pleasure and privilege for me to have Ankur here in this session today. Dr. Ankur Madan is Associate Director and Faculty at the School of Education, Azim Premji University. She teaches courses in child development and inclusive education in the Masters in Education program. She also anchors short-term programs in early childhood education, inclusive education, and learning disabilities that are offered to working professionals. Dr. Madan did her doctoral studies from the University of Delhi in the area of inclusive education and has previously taught in Delhi University, Christ University, Bangalore, and the American University at Kuwait. Her writing and research are in the areas of both child development and inclusive education. A warm welcome to you, Ankur. Lovely to have you on this session. Thank you so much for joining in. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nimi. So Nimi, I'll just take 30 seconds to say this, that Nimi was clearly my first boss in that sense, because I think it was 29, 30 years ago.
That
it was my first job of working at the JDM for a couple of months.
Yes.
And much water has flown under the bridge since then, but it's really wonderful to be back, and thank you so much Nimi.
Thank you, Ankur. It was a short stint from your end, but it's left very good memories, so I'm so glad to have you back on this.
Thank you. Same here, very fond memories. Okay, thank you all for being here. I'm not sure what your expectations are, but I am just going to take some time, say 45 to 50 minutes, to talk about some largely broad ideas about how I have understood inclusive education and why I think that there are some gaps in concept and practice that we need to talk about, that we need to sort of deliberate upon, particularly with respect to the conceptions of inclusive education in the Indian context. Okay, so I'm just going to broadly touch upon some of these things in whatever time we have. A lot of these things would only be introduced because they in itself require us to spend a lot more time deliberating and perhaps going into. In the question and answer session, we can discuss anything that you want me to elaborate further on. Okay. Okay, so we'll begin with the first very basic kind of question of what is inclusive education. And I just want to say that, I teach a course. I've been teaching this course in inclusive education in a master's program for more than 9 years now. And much of whatever I have written and spoken about or researched has been largely in this area. But answering this question of what is inclusive education is actually the hardest, because there are no easy answers at all. It is extremely difficult to arrive at a consensus or to arrive at a definition which seems acceptable to everyone. And hence, even a seemingly innocuous kind of sounding question of what is inclusive education seems rather complex to answer. And as we go along, I will try and respond to that with respect to why I think it is a complex question to answer, particularly in the context of India, right? Inclusive education literature, whether Western or Indian, is replete with what inclusive education is not, rather than what it is. And hence it's a difficult question to answer. So everywhere you read, or most scholars, researchers who work in this area will begin by talking about inclusive education, introducing it as something that it is not. It is not this, it is not that, but really not arriving at conceptions of inclusive education which seem to be acceptable to a large audience. Uh, Largely because there are no clear definitions and there are multiple ways in which it has been interpreted. In the context of India, it is something that originated quite recently. So for a history, or for a country as large as ours with such an old history, it's a concept that became popular only in the 90s. So its origins are rather recent, and hence we have perhaps not really had the time or also perhaps the intention to engage with the conception of inclusive education for our own understanding, for what it means to us enough. So we have not perhaps engaged with it enough, and hence we do not have this clarity in understanding what inclusive education is. And I'll just give you an example, since we're talking about earlier times, that when I was doing my PhD in the 90s, I started out by my PhD title still says integrated education. And it was during the course of my PhD that I stumbled upon this concept, this term in some Western writing called inclusive education. And I was really intrigued by it. I was very, very, interested in understanding what inclusive education is and how it is different from conceptions of integrated education as we understood them back then and even now. In India, the term has been essentially criticized to a large extent as being highly romanticized and fancy. So it appears that we seem to have borrowed something, a conception from the West, which just has this feel good kind of connotation, or feel good kind of thing that is associated with it, but is not really something that we understand completely, right? And we use it synonymously with integrated education, which is a huge, huge problem, right? So we know that inclusive education is not integrated education, but we still don't know what it really is. However, over these past years, from the decades of the 90s, inclusive education has certainly found its place in our policy, right? If you look at all major legislations and policy documents, and I've listed here just 3 of them, you will find in some way or the other, inclusive education makes an appearance. It makes an appearance in the sense of being mentioned as an important focus of policy, as something that we want to make happen, as something that we want to implement and embrace in principle as well as in practice. And you see that quite explicitly coming out, particularly in the Rights for Persons with Disability Act of 2016, and now has been given some impetus by the National Education Policy of 2020 as well, which means that we seem to have a strong, serious commitment towards making inclusive education happen, but without necessarily having a clear understanding of what it really means for us. And I'm saying that emphatically again and again, because I do feel, and this is in the course of my having researched or whatever little engagement I've had with this area, that it's important for us to really do that. We need to arrive at an understanding of inclusive education from the contextual realities of our country, which I feel that we have not done enough. Okay, so here's just a sort of a conceptual kind of a map of some important questions that need to be asked about inclusive education. I'm not the author of this conception. There's somebody called Armstrong and Spandag who have proposed these questions. I've just put them here. And I think I've always, in my class in inclusive education, I sort of begin the course by putting up these questions and saying that the day we are able to figure out responses to what each of these mean, then we have understood inclusive education, right? So the first one is inclusive education for whom? Whose inclusion are we talking about, right? And how do we arrive at that? It's not as simple as it sounds, right? When we say, well, when we talk about inclusive education, we are talking about children with disabilities, we are talking about children from all kinds of marginal backgrounds, we're talking about children, the girl child, or any other kind of form of caste, class, race, marginalization that we see around, we're talking about their inclusion. Sure enough, but one, who is included, who is left out, right? Who decides who is to be included, who is to be left out? And the moment you start identifying these categories, that it's for the disabled, it's for children from marginalized communities, it's for children, the girl child, or it's from a minority religion or culture, or so on and so forth, you are already creating exclusions, right? I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say here, because by identifying categories of people, you are already creating exclusionary categories, which means that inclusion is for this person, but not necessarily for this, right? So this question of for whom is actually a very, very important question to ask. And in addition to this for whom question is the question to ask, who decides inclusion is for whom, right? Is it the person whom we are including? That person gets to decide, or is it my prerogative as the majority, as the one who is in the so-called mainstream, who's deciding who should be included, right? So hence it is a complex question in itself. The other question to ask is into what? Inclusion into what, right? And this question is very, very relevant in our context. And that is largely where I'm going actually with this particular interaction with you all, as to the what of inclusive education in the Indian context is very significant. When we are talking about including people, what is it that we are including them into? What is that context that we are including them into, right? The third question to ask is with what purpose? The why question. Why inclusive education? What purpose does it serve? Is it really as good as it seemingly sounds? Like I said, that a lot of people, the critiques of inclusive education, have said that inclusive education does not work. It is not feasible in our context. It is just something that is highly romanticized. It just seems something that is nice that we seem to have borrowed from the West. Do we have enough justification for it? Do we have enough reasons to say with certain degree of conviction that inclusive education is the way to go for our country, that we are willing to embrace it? Hence, the purpose of it is very, very important. And then the big one is the how question, right? The how meaning, how do you make it work? How do you make it happen? How do you realize it in practice? And that, of course, is the biggest one actually, right? How do you really make inclusive education happen? And if we are able to answer these questions, the for whom question, the into what question, the purpose, and then the practice question, then you seem to have figured out inclusive education. Then you seem to have solved this complex kind of mystery of what inclusive education really is and what it means, right? I'll just take a pause here for you to think about it, and then I'll move on. Right. Just now, I am not claiming that I will be responding to all these questions, these 4 questions that I've put here. I will try and respond to them only sparingly and perhaps not in a very systematic manner. So please excuse me for that. But like I said, that when we are having a discussion, when we are doing our Q&A, we can talk about it a lot more. All right. But I do feel that there is some value in talking a little bit about the origins of inclusive education, right? Because it tries to answer the question of for what purpose, right? So why inclusive education? Where did it originate from? What is the thinking behind inclusive education? Why should we be talking about it? Why is policy giving it so much importance? Why is the world talking about inclusive education right now? And by origins, I'm not necessarily talking about the historical trajectory of it, but where does it really lie? How does it come about? Now, before I even do that, I also want to say this, that inclusive education, interestingly, and which adds to its complexity, is that inclusion in itself is a philosophical, a theoretical, and a practice component, right? It has a philosophical component, it has a theoretical component, and it has a practice component. And the marriage of all of this is what makes it complex. So it is a philosophy, it's a way of thought, it's a way of thinking. It is a theory, it is based on certain ideas, it is based on certain theoretical understanding. And then you talk about its practice, you make it work. How do you make it happen? Okay, let's talk about the origins. So the origins of inclusive education primarily lie in the fact that it comes from the rights-based approach, right? The human rights-based approach, that it is the right of every human being on this planet to enjoy the right to education, right? That right to education is a universal and fundamental human right. And as you all know, that our country is also committed to that, right? So human right, that it's every person's right to be educated, and the fact that to belong to the so-called mainstream or to belong to this world, right? So the right to education being a universal and fundamental human right is something that provides the impetus to the idea of inclusion. Hence, everybody needs to be part of it. Everybody has a right to be part of it, right? The other kind of understanding, largely coming from the Western thought, is that schools have a very, very important role to play in creating a democratic and inclusive society. So if the world needs to be, if it is a human right that everybody deserves to go through education, then the school plays an important part in creating those democratic societies and inclusive societies. And hence schools should become inclusive, schools should become inclusive spaces themselves to create those models, because the school is a microcosm in itself. It's a microcosm that reflects the society. Hence, the school plays an important part in doing that. A very, very big push for inclusive education comes from this very big paradigm shift that the society has made. It is difficult to say that we have also made that shift in our mindsets. It's very difficult to say that. Is this shift in the medical model understanding of disability to what we call the social model of disability, or the social justice model of disability, or even the social and cultural model of disability. I don't want to elaborate a lot on this. I would like to assume that you may have some sense of what this means. But the medical model, largely, very briefly, for those of you who may not be familiar, basically talks about the clinical, the individual, the deficit aspect of disability. It focuses on that, which means that you identify people based on the deficits that they have. based on what is it that they cannot do, and the onus on a person to adjust or to become part of the society is on the person with the disability, right? I hope you understand what I'm saying here. That is that if I am a person with disability, it is my problem to adapt myself to be part of the society, right? So the onus is on the individual and the focus is on the deficit. So there is a diagnosis and it is identified clinically all the things that you cannot do. So the understanding of what is called a handicap and impairment and disability comes from this medical model. So an impairment is the clinical condition. That is what you cannot do. What is it? The function that you lack. So a blind person, a person who has blindness cannot see. A person who has a hearing impairment cannot hear. A person who has a physical or a locomotor disability cannot perhaps walk or does not have mobility, right? So the focus is on what you cannot do. That's the deficit model. The shift in thinking in this happened when we moved to a social model of disability, where it was very, very categorically realized that the barriers exist in the society and not in the person, right? So the barriers exist in the society and not in the person, which means that if you are able to make adaptations to the environment, to the society, a lot of these seemingly or what are called deficits can be overcome. So if you provide a wheelchair and ramps, right, to public buildings and public areas, then a person who does not have mobility of its own overcomes that barrier. So it is not the person who has the disability anymore, but there are barriers in the society that need to be removed. So when this shift happened in the thinking from the medical model to the social model of disability, inclusive education became automatically the ideal or the philosophy or the way for this society to restructure itself or for the society to make adjustments to itself. And therefore, this shift is attributed as being one of the most important reasons or rationale for inclusive education in society. Then, of course, the movement or the shift from special education, right, which leads to segregation and institutionalization. So special education, by virtue of what it is, talks about segregation, right? Because it tends to separate people out. It believes it is founded on the belief that people who have disabilities or who have these so-called deficits, so the special education comes from the medical model. So the focus is on the deficit. You are assuming that this person requires something that is special that cannot be provided by the society at large, right? So it cannot be provided in the mainstream, you have to remove them. So it automatically leads to segregation and institutionalization, right? So therefore, the movement away from special education led to inclusive education. So it's almost the opposite of what special education says. So segregation and institutionalization there was a huge resistance for segregation and institutionalization, particularly from the West. We never had that parallel system of education in our country. We never had that luxury. Economically, we were never so sound to be able to create those parallel systems of education in our society. But we were tending towards that. We definitely have been tending towards that as well. But this resistance or this pushback from segregation and institutionalization also led to inclusive education. And then inclusive education, lastly, but certainly not the least, is founded on this very, very strong belief that inclusive education actually improves the quality of overall education, right? That it actually leads to the improvement in the quality of education. by providing equal and meaningful opportunities and participation for all learners. So the moment you believe that inclusive education is for everybody, the moment you believe that it can actually improve the quality of meaningful participation of everyone, of all learners in society, in education institutions, then inclusive education has a very, very important role to play in that, right? So these are some ways in which inclusive education has received impetus. These are some ways of thinking that have made inclusive education what it is in terms of being embraced by countries across the world and including us, including India. Okay, now let's really talk about what inclusive education is, right? Now, like I said right in the beginning, that it is rather complex. It is very difficult to find a definition. It is not easy. It has multiple interpretations. Everybody seems to have their own way of thinking about it, etc., etc. But what I'm going to do is I'm not getting into those debates. I'm not getting into those contentions. I will just talk about just 3 or 4 things that inclusive education definitely is. Okay, some of those things that inclusive education definitely is. Inclusive education definitely focuses on supporting the learning needs of all learners. A huge misconception about inclusive education, and I'm referring back to the question that I asked first about for whom, right? The for whom question is very, very critical, and I'm sorry for belaboring the point and emphasizing again and again that the question of who is inclusive education meant for is a very important question to ask, right? Inclusive education is not just for children with disabilities. It is not just for children from marginalized communities, race, class, whatever. It is something that is committed to supporting the learning needs of all learners. And that's why the all is in bold, it is in italics, right? So, and that's a very, very big misconception about inclusive education, because the moment you say inclusive education, most people think we're talking only about children with special needs, we're only talking about a certain kind of category of children and so on and so forth. So that's an important thing, that inclusive education focuses on supporting the learning of all children, of all learners. It aims at increasing the learning and participation of learners and minimizing the effects of barriers, right? So what does it do and how does it do it? It aims at improving the learning and participation. And here it's very important that we are not just talking about removing barriers of access. Okay, it's very important to understand that we are not just doing some job of opening gates that seem to have been shut on children with disabilities or any other child with from a marginalized or disadvantaged kind of background. It is not just that, it is also providing a learning experience, right? It is also about providing a learning experience which is meaningful and enriching. Okay, so it is about minimizing the barriers that are there in learning and participation of all children. And what kind of barriers are we talking about? We're talking about physical barriers, we are talking about economic barriers, we are talking about social barriers and attitudinal barriers, cultural barriers as well. And there is a lot of that in our society. There's lots and lots of baggage that we all carry in terms of which become barriers to learning and participation of children. So inclusive education is committed to breaking down these barriers of all kinds. Now, how does it do that? It implies definitely a restructuring of the school in terms of curriculum, assessment, and pedagogy. Inclusive education will not happen on its own, right? That's why I said that a lot of people have said that, oh, it's a very nice idea, it's very romantic, and it's all very feel good kind of a thing. But how do you really make it work? It does require a shift, not just in thinking, it requires a shift in the ways in which we look at what we teach, how we teach, and how do we assess it. So at the level of the school, at the level of the classroom, at the level of administration, and pretty much every vertical and horizontal that is there in the school system, it requires some kind of rethinking and restructuring in terms of all of these, right? And those are, like I said, the barriers are not just physical, not just that of access. Access is a barrier, a huge barrier, certainly, but it's not the only one. And therefore, inclusive education implies that you will do something, right, to remove those barriers and make what are called nowadays reasonable accommodations in your curriculum, in how you assess children and how you teach children in order to make it happen, in order to make it work, right? And the processes that the schools adopt should improve the learning outcomes of all children, benefit a large majority and not just a few. Again, the question of for whom. So inclusive education is not and will never work if you focus on 5 or 6 or 10 children in your classroom or in your school who seem to be having some learning problems or learning difficulties which you have identified. Then inclusive education is not feasible, certainly not in our country, right? The argument is that we have lakhs of other children, there are so many more than whom we have to cater to, and so on and so forth. So inclusive education will only work when you understand that it is meant for all children, that it is something that can improve the learning outcomes of all children and will benefit a very large majority, maybe not everyone, that claim we cannot make, right? But a large majority and not just a few. And the last point, which is a very important one, is that inclusive education is a continuous process. Okay, it is something that you work towards. It is not something that you predetermine as a goal and reach. It is a dynamic process that you begin to work towards. And you don't necessarily, there is no end in that sense in sight that you can say that the day I achieve this, I have reached full inclusion. And that almost is mythical at this point of time. In our country, in the context in which we live, it is a mythical thing. It is highly unlikely that there will be a day when we'll be able to say that, oh, we've now achieved full inclusion. I really doubt that. At least I don't think I will see it in my lifetime for sure, right? And that is one of the reasons. That is one of the reasons why sorry, that is one of the reasons why we also hesitate to take steps to make inclusive education happen. We hesitate because we feel that, oh, but we will never be able to get there. Hence, it is important to understand that it is something that you work towards. It is something that you begin somewhere. See it as a continuum, something that you have to keep working on and reach, but not necessarily have an end goal to determine, right? That's very, very important. And this is just some basic tenets, I would say, of inclusive education. Definitely not the only ones. There are many, many other things. The more you read, the more authors you look at will give you more and more sort of ideas on what inclusive education should be or should not be. But these are just some broad tenets, which I hope will give you some sense of what, at least in my understanding, or I would like to believe, inclusive education implies or means. Okay. I'm happy to take a pause here.
Thank you, Ankur.
Yeah.
For a very, very clear and informative presentation. I'm sure the students, will have a better understanding of inclusive education now, and they'll, when they go back to their classrooms and think about it, they will have a much clearer picture of the entire process, as you call it. Yes, it is indeed a process. It's not something that one can complete, in that sense. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll do the Q&A later, right, Nimi?
Yes, please complete your presentation.
Okay, fine, great. Okay, yeah. See, that's the thing with the online mode. You don't even know if anybody's listening, so it's fine.
No, we all are here.
I'm sure they're all listening.
Yes.
Okay. So this is just something for you to read. What is really an imagination of an inclusive environment? Again, like I said, that it is a process. It is mythical to believe that you can attain and achieve full inclusion, but an inclusive environment should or be perhaps like this, an environment that promotes the full personal, academic, and professional development of all learners, irrespective of race, class, gender, disability, religion, culture, sexual preference, learning styles, and language. It is one which is free from discrimination, segregation, and harassment, and which intentionally tries to facilitate an atmosphere of acceptance and respect, right? It is also an environment which respects learners and values them as partners in teaching and learning. It respects the rights of all learners and enables them to participate fully in a democratic society, right? And this is a UNESCO definition. Yeah, you can just read it and I'll move on. Okay, now we'll come to some of these Now I'll just talk a little bit about some of these contentions and debates in inclusive education that I kind of started with, and why it is difficult to arrive at a coherent, collaborative, or consensual kind of understanding of inclusive education, right? Because one, it means different things to different people, right? It means different things to different people, essentially because different, like I said, that it is a philosophical concept, it is also a theoretical concept, and it is also a concept that is understood by practitioners, those who make it happen. So philosophers think of it in one way. The theoreticians or the people like us who work in academia think of it one way. And then there are those who have to make it happen, or those who have to make it work. So it means different things to different people, and it's difficult to reconcile and bring all of this together to arrive at a coherent understanding, right? Essentially, what is perhaps not unique about inclusive education, but clearly one of the characteristics of inclusive education, which lends itself to the complexity that it is, the difference between its ideology and practice creates multiple interpretations and definitions, which means that what we think is desirable, right? What we think is desirable, because we seem to have this ideal or ideology or belief about what we think inclusive education is and should be, is quite different from what seems to be achievable or what it is in practice. And that is perhaps something that really creates this contention. That is inclusive education what it is meant to be in ideology, or is it that which is achievable in practice, right? How do I even gain an understanding of inclusive practice then, right? What is inclusive practice, or what is inclusive education in practice? Is it that which is what it is meant to be, or is it that which is achievable? And when I'm talking about achievable, I'm talking about with all the complexities and all the problems and difficulties and challenges that there are in making it happen. I hope you see what I'm trying to suggest here, right? That, and that lends itself to a huge debate in arriving at a coherent understanding of, therefore, what should we look at inclusive education as. Then that's not all. Criticism or debates in inclusive education are also related to the measurable outcomes of inclusion. What should we see as success of inclusion? How do you measure? When do you know inclusion has been successful? Should we look at achievement of the children who are included? Should we look at those or the society in which those children have been included? What are some measurable outcomes of inclusion? Otherwise otherwise it remains what we were talking about earlier, that as just something which is feel good. It just feels nice. You feel like you're a good person if you've done something like this. But is it really benefiting? Is it really? And when I say benefiting, what does that benefit mean? How do I measure that benefit? Is it something that is actually leading to inclusion in the society or creating an inclusive or a democratic society? Is it really doing that? And if so, is that enough? Or is it creating more difficulties, more challenges, or whatever? So what are some important, desirable, measurable outcomes of inclusion? Another epistemological kind of question that we talk about, which is to do with how do you know any of this? Who contributes to this knowledge? What or who are the sources of knowledge in inclusive education? Should I be talking to philosophers? Should I be talking to academics like me? Should I be talking to teachers in schools? Should I be talking to parents? Should I be talking to the children, right? Who are or what are the sources of knowledge in inclusive education? What are the legitimate sources of knowledge in inclusive education? Who contributes to this knowledge? How do I answer these above questions about outcome, about inclusive practice? Where should I gather my knowledge from? Because when you talk to a person who's making policy or who's a philosopher or who's sitting out there and philosophizing about it, that person says, yeah, well, it's an ideal. What is the problem? It comes from a rights-based approach. It is something that we should make happen. But when you go to the reality of a classroom, right? When you go to the reality of a classroom in a government school in any Indian town or village, you find a completely different scenario. So you ask that teacher, what do you think inclusive education is? What in your view, or what are your beliefs about inclusion? And she gives you a completely different picture. Or you ask a parent, right? Or you ask the child, or you ask that person herself and say, where do you really want to be? What is your view? And that person tells you that, yeah, sure, I want to be part of the society, but do you know how much discrimination I face? How do I feel when the teacher doesn't even look at me in the classroom? How do I feel when the teacher knows that I'm sitting here and I cannot hear very well, or I cannot see the board or something, and she continues to write on the board and teach? How do you think that makes me feel, right? So who are these people? The stakeholders is a simple term that one uses, but I think it goes a little beyond that. And when I say sources of knowledge, I'm here talking about not just stakeholders, but how do you then arrive at evidence-based kind of knowledge in inclusive education, right? So I'm talking about collecting evidence about inclusive education and who should then be contributing to that. And similarly, what role does policy play in all this? What role can policy possibly play? Where does policy come in? Or policy is based on our ideology. Policy is based on what we think we should be doing as a country. And yes, it gives impetus to practice. There is no doubt about that. The fact that we are sitting here, so many of us talking about inclusive education, is because of the visibility that it has got, because we see value in it. And policy has played its part in that, for sure. No doubt about that. But shouldn't policy also be driven by the realities on the ground? Or should it be the other way around, right? Should policy change the reality on the ground? Absolutely. Or should realities on the ground also give insights into the policymakers' ideas, right? So these are some, and these are very few. Trust me, there are many, many more. But these are some broad debates and contentions that we need to visit in the context of inclusive education in our country. Sorry. Okay, I'm not going to become a teacher, all teacher here and talk about conceptual models and things like that, but I do feel I use this particular model to talk about inclusive education in India, which I find useful. So I'm just going to spend 2 minutes talking about these 3 E's. It's called the 3E model. It was proposed by Nidhi Singhal. She's an author that you all should read if you haven't. She's done a lot of work in this area in our country. She talks about 3 important components that we should look at inclusive education from. Okay, 3 important kind of principles or components through which the lens that we should use for looking at inclusive education in the Indian context, right? One of which we've already spoken about, which is entry. The first E is for entry. That is, all children should be part of the education system. So it's a question of access, right? It's a question of access. The second one is an important one, which is about engagement, right? Meaning that once you are part of the school system, then the experience for you should be meaningful, joyful, and engaging. We have sort of been able to get a lot of children into schools, right? A lot of children with disabilities into the school system. But is their engagement in the classroom, in their participation or the learning in the classroom actually meaningful, actually joyful and engaging? And that's a big question to ask for us in our country. It really isn't. Hence, that is not an inclusive environment, right? Just getting children into the school system, sort of removing that access barrier is clearly not enough. And we haven't, I'm not saying that we've done enough in that, certainly not. But even there, even if we do get children into the school system, because we have RTE, we cannot refuse admission now and so on and so forth, but that doesn't necessarily mean that once the child is in the classroom, what do we do with them? What is the kind of discrimination, the kind of prejudice, the kind of biases, the stereotypes that are prevailing? And not just all of that, are we doing anything in the classroom to make that child's experience meaningful? Am I adapting my content? Am I adapting my pedagogy? Am I adapting my assessment in order to make that person's experience engaging, right? The third one is about empowerment. And this has to do with the larger aims of education. That what is this education doing to empower, right? The into what purpose question, if you remember from what I had shown earlier, with what purpose are we talking about inclusive education? This has to do with empowerment. Why are you doing this? What capabilities, what rights, what resources, what opportunities are you providing? What are the aims with which you are providing this education? So what are you equipping the person with? So if I am a person with disability, do I have the capability, the resources, and the opportunities to make my own choices and decisions? Because I seem to live in a society where someone else is constantly making those choices for me. Someone else is making those decisions for me. Somebody is sitting out there and deciding that I am only good for doing carpet weaving, or I'm only good for candle making, or I can only do carpentry work, or that I can only do history and literature in school, but I cannot study science and maths, right? So somebody is making those decisions, and it's been like that for years and years together. Somebody seems to be deciding that I am a person with blindness, so therefore I'm capable of not learning science, I'm not capable of learning geometry or maths or this or that. I can only study history, I can only study economics or whatever. So hence, those are the streams that have been decided for me. Those are the subjects that have been decided for me. Those are the vocations that have been decided for me. Those are the professions that have been decided for me. Where is the choice? Where do I have the resources and opportunities to make them? And hence the third E is the empowerment, which really is the one that has to do with the aims of education. And there's very interesting kind of evidence-based studies which now tell you that how these aims of education are seen by different stakeholders, how a teacher views it versus a parent versus a policymaker versus the school administration and versus the person. So a person with disability in a classroom, how do they view their rights, and how do they think what education should be doing for them, right? So this, I always find that this conceptual model is a very useful model to study inclusive education from the Indian context. Okay, now I'm just going to take the last 10 minutes or so, and I'd be very happy to have a discussion with all of you about this. Talking about some gaps in practice in India. Again, this is something that we can really open up and go into numbers and so on and so forth, but I'm not going to do that because I think that's something that we can have a discussion around, but also perhaps something that you already may have familiarity with. If you don't, you can certainly gain it. Yeah, the first point that I'm making here is that it's really, really important for us to acknowledge the context, right? The context within which we are talking about inclusion. Remember my question about into what? Inclusion into what? What are we? Where is this? What is the context into which we are talking about inclusion? And here it's important for us to talk about numbers for sure, prevalence data, and not just the prevalence data, but the contentions in that. I'm sure many of you know that in our country till date, even with the census and whatever else that we do, we still don't necessarily have very convincing data on the prevalence of disability in our country. We still don't really know. Right now with the RPWD Act, we have a much longer list of disabilities. We have included 21 disabilities as opposed to 7 in the previous act. And it is quite likely when the census of 2022 or whenever it happens that the number of people with disabilities will turn out to be much, much, much larger than what it ever is, right? Or whatever it has been. Hence, that context becomes very, very important. We should know what we are talking about. Who are we talking about? Where is this? And who are the people we identify as, right? And of course, the context also includes not just numbers, it also includes the beliefs that we have been carrying about disability, the stigma that confounds disability to this day. And this comes from that very medical model kind of thinking, where the focus is on the deficit, and where we have this ideas of bechara, and we feeling charitable towards. So it's a charitable model that brings in ideas about doing something for them and feeling sorry for them. So there's lots of sympathy, but there is no empathy. And the fact that you feel that it lowers expectations, right? It lowers expectations with respect to what we think they are capable of. So hence questions of empowerment. You do not even believe that they can be empowered. You do not even believe that you can, that there is capability and there is actual empowerment that you can provide to people with disabilities to make their own decisions. And that's the context that in India we cannot ignore. We have to take that into consideration. Then questions about access, I will not dwell on this for long because we've already spoken about this. That is ambiguity in determining who should be included and who should not be. So we really are not very clear about whose inclusion are we talking about. And very importantly, whose perspective is important here? Who decides who should be included? Whose decisions are being taken into consideration? Are all stakeholders being considered, right? Are they all being consulted? So is the teacher being asked? Is the parent being asked? Is the child being asked? What is the policymaker's view on this? What is the school administrator's view on this? What are the implications for financials within that school? How does it really work? So question of access is not as simple as it sounds. It is a very complex question that we should be talking about. Then we've already spoken about that inclusion into what? In a country where we are still struggling, right? We are definitely struggling with quality of education, right? Our overall education indicators are not really good. You know that learning, all your ASER surveys and all show that we are really falling behind as far as quality of education is concerned. And God only knows what will happen post the pandemic with 2 years of almost zero learning for our children, right? So what are we including children into? Is the system really in that sense available? Is the system ready to include? And that's a big question to ask in our country. Yeah. Hence, the poor quality of learning experience raises doubts about inclusive education effectiveness, right? So because there is poor quality of learning as it is, it raises doubts about its effectiveness. Right. The reasons for that is lack of teacher training. We have not given enough emphasis to inclusive education in any of our teacher training programs, whether they are at the pre-service level or then at the in-service level. It leads to attitudinal issues for sure. Teachers are part of the society. They carry the same baggage as the rest of us. So there are barriers that come with this because we have not exposed them enough. They are resistant to the idea of having children with disabilities or learning difficulties or just challenged children with learning challenges in their classrooms, right? So therefore, the focus has always been on their lack of preparedness rather than issues of children learning needs, which means that whenever there are lots of studies now available in India, a lot of people do this study of talking to teachers about attitudes towards inclusive education. Pretty much all of those studies show that teachers say that, oh, I do not have the skills. I do not know how to do this, or I have not been adequately prepared, right? The children's learning need is never the focus of these studies. It's always, I do not know. I have not been adequately prepared. It's also because you have not been exposed to it, because you have never really engaged enough to understand what the child's learning need is. In my view, my very own personal view, which is rather perhaps controversial, is that every teacher intuitively can become an inclusive teacher. If you are a good teacher, you can be an inclusive teacher. You just have to have the mindset to be able to do it, right? Then, of course, we have not had enough scholarly engagement with the issue, which is what I was talking about earlier, that the sources of knowledge are not clear. If I'm not sure about how to collect that evidence, if I'm not sure about what research I should be doing, I'm not able to validate my position. I'm not convincing in my arguments. With what conviction should I, in that sense, be able to sell inclusion? To whom? I have not engaged with it enough, right? Conflicting views on aims of education, we've already spoken about, that we don't seem to have a clear idea about what should be the aims of education for people with disabilities. What is it that we should be teaching them, and with what purpose, right? The focus has been on compensation and deficits, and there is poor expectation, which leads to setting of goals that ignore the individual's self-worth, which is also something that we've already spoken about, right? I'm just going to conclude, hopefully on a slightly more positive note, and say that even with all this, yet we have a very strong commitment to inclusive education. The commitment is loud and clear, and it is out there, and it should be. It most certainly should be. And there are fairly good examples of inclusive education in schools in India, even in schools which are poorly resourced, even in schools which you seem to think are very traditional in the way they think. So inclusive education is, in that sense, not necessarily some kind of magic that you have to do. What it requires is belief and conviction. So there are actually good exemplars, and I've been very fortunate to see some of them. Really, really good examples of inclusive education actually working well in the system. Of course, one would like to ask questions about what is a good example. How do I know this is a good example? How do I know that it is working or not? Yes, certainly all of those questions are valid, right? But one can see that there are some spaces, some examples where you can find that the children are happy, children are engaged, the whole system seems to be working in one cohesive manner to the commitment that they seem to have embraced, right? And I've already said that inclusive education should be seen as a process and not an outcome. Each school must embrace inclusive education going forward. It is no longer a matter of choice. And that, I think, is very, very important. And I'm saying that not only because our policy demands it now. It is something that we need to very, very consciously and explicitly state and embrace that, yes, we are committed to inclusion. We are. It is not a choice. It is not something that you do because it's fancy, because you feel that it's something that I should do because it will make me feel good, right? Inclusive education is effective when it is driven by a clear vision and leadership which is supportive of inclusion. There is no doubt about that either. There is enough evidence of it that leadership plays a very, very important part. What you require is a clear vision, and that vision can be whatever. You can have your own vision of inclusion, but you need to have a supportive leadership, a supportive administration to make it work. Nevertheless, the teacher in the classroom plays the most important role in translating this vision into reality, right? The teacher in the classroom is at the center of all of this. She's the pivot who runs this, and she therefore is the one who needs the most attention if you want inclusive education or inclusion to work. A comprehensive whole school collaborative approach is most appropriate, right? While the teacher is at the pivot, she needs the support of everyone around her. So comprehensive whole school cohesive approach is what makes inclusive education work, right? And very importantly, there is no such thing as a single model of inclusion that can be proposed. The solutions have to be local, they have to be contextual. There are principles, but there are no models. There are principles that you can adopt, that you can embrace, which are general, which are common, but there is no such thing as a single model of inclusion that works, that you can embrace. Okay, and that's pretty much what I had to say. Thank you all very much. I hope I have.
Thank you, Ankur, for weaving all the aspects of inclusive education so beautifully and yet in a simplistic manner, which I think the students can relate to. And I think I won't stand between you and the audience, because I'm sure they have questions and queries, and there are lots of comments in the chat box too. So audience, you can unmute yourselves.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks, Nimi. I'll be happy if there are any questions.
Yeah, they can
Happy to take.
and
Yeah. Oh, I
ask
thought there were questions in the chat, but no. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's something else.
Hi, Ankur. This is Vinita Bhargav.
Hi. Oh my God. Hi, ma'am. How are you?
Wow, it was wonderful. I am so proud of the thing, how you pulled everything together. It's just
goodness.
really nice to hear you.
Thank you, Dr. Bhargav. Oh my God, you made my day by being here. Thank you so much.
It's just so wonderful to see you to pull inclusion together with the whole macro perspective that you were able to bring in. Sometimes we just look at the micro classroom and try and understand it like that. And it has always been something that has kind of irked me, that very often we look at it only in the context of disability, whereas in the whole context of India today is so exclusionary that to think of inclusion in the micro space of a classroom is something so hard. Look at what is happening around, the kind of hate speeches and all kinds of things that are happening. And in the context of that, how do we actually think of inclusion in the classroom? And I think you did it fabulously, staying out of the, the challenging issues, but yet bringing them in. So congratulations, you've done a great job.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Bhargav, for your comments, and I couldn't agree more with you. And that's why I said she's woven everything so beautifully, and yet in such a simplistic manner that I'm so glad that Ankur, I have you here for this session. We are planning on a series on disability, and I'm so glad that I began the series with you. So once again, a huge thanks to you. And thank you, Professor Bhargav, for being in the session today.
Exactly. Nimmi, I would like to, hello Ankur, this is Rekha Sapra.
Oh, hi.
How are you? It was wonderful.
Good. This is wonderful.
All through, and then it was absolutely wonderful. And I totally agree with what Nimmi and Professor Bhargava has said. It was beautifully woven, and all the different aspects and almost conflicting and contradicting aspects have been woven so beautifully. I'm so happy. So happy. I was just remembering our Oxford deliveries over there.
Yes.
We had met over there, and it was
many years ago.
And I could just the two of us were there. And congratulations for this wonderful talk today. And I'm sure our teacher and students are also there who are teaching this paper. Swati Sahani is the one who's taking this paper, and I'm sure whenever JDM College organizes these workshops, we'll definitely be there in all of them. And thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. Okay,
Thank
Ankur.
Thank you, Professor Rekha Sapra, now Principal Bharti College, for
Oh,
attending
okay.
this
Okay.
webinar.
Wow.
I said it because I wasn't sure Ankur knew about it. So
No,
thank you
I didn't
so
know.
much.
I didn't
Yeah,
know.
yeah. Thank
Rekha
you
and I
so
met
much
many
for
years ago.
coming. You're really hard pressed for
Thank you,
time,
Rekha.
Rekha. But it's really nice of you to
Thank you.
join in, and you
It was
always
a
join in
pleasure for
for our
me.
initiatives.
Thank
I
you,
know
Nimi.
that.
It was a real pleasure for me. And
Yeah.
Ankur, thank you very much. Real
I think.
insights.
Yeah.
Very
I
much.
think
Insights have been given.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Surya has raised a
Yeah.
hand. You can unmute and ask your question, please? Huh?
Yeah, good morning, madam.
Good morning.
Yes, ma'am, I am Surya Mani Prasad. Previously, I was working with Samagra Shiksha Jharkhand, and we do visit schools related to inclusive education. And many times I got a question like, a teacher, resource teacher, or as a special educator, he has qualification in hearing impairment, but many times he has to see the child who has blindness or who has intellectual impairment. So he asked like how to manage these children cross disabilities. So they are not capable to do those children uh, who has cross disability. So how we can improve inclusive education in government, that we have very confusion or a very tough situation to tackle those children in our schools.
Yeah. So, Surya, thank you. What you've asked is a very, very important and pertinent question. No easy answers. But I very briefly, what I would like to say is that this basic premise, okay, on which this idea of having IERTs or inclusive education resource teachers who are trained in one disability and are expected to work in other disability areas is wrong. Okay, I think that this premise basically defies what inclusion is meant to do. Inclusive education is not supposed to cater to individual needs of children with specific disabilities in this manner. What you need to do is adopt what are called broader principles of, say, some practices like universal designs for learning, or differentiation for that matter, right? So differentiation, for instance, I can give you an example, is a practice where the teacher adapts her learning materials, her pedagogy, and her assessment to cater to needs of all the children with the support of a special educator, right? So which means that the special educator's role is not to work directly with the child, but support the work of the teacher in the classroom in order to make those accommodations. And when she makes that adaptation, it is not for one child or two children who have disabilities in the classroom, but for all of them. That is why the emphasis is on this, the fact that inclusive education benefits every child in the classroom and not just one or two or three. Okay, and that is the reason why I'm saying that the premises in itself is wrong. This idea of having IERTs to support what is being referred to as inclusive education, and whether it's in Jharkhand or Karnataka or Tamil Nadu, it's pretty much the same everywhere in the country, is wrong. We need to rethink that. Hence, the teacher in the classroom is the pivot. She's the one who's at the center of this and not the special educator. The special educator's role is to support the regular teacher and not that. And the regular teacher does not therefore necessarily require the specific training to work with a particular disability. I mean, just look at it this way. The imagination of it is wrong, right? You cannot have 20 different special educators in every school, right? Catering to individual needs of all the children with disabilities. It is not, it's impractical, it is unthinkable. In a country which is strapped for resources the way that ours is, it is unthinkable, and it is not even a place for us to go at all, right? So it is a larger shift, systemic kind of shift in thinking that we need to make, and in the way we imagine how inclusive education will work in the future. Okay. So it is the regular teacher who needs support to become capable of adopting such practices. Maybe someday we can do a session on what differentiation is and how it actually works, and how there are very simple things that teachers can do within their classroom which cater to the needs of all the children in their classes, right? But the special educator's role is not being undermined here. Her role as being the specialist in that whole picture is very, very important. Very, very extremely important. Yeah.
Yeah, the next person can ask, whoever wants to ask. Kindly unmute yourselves and ask your questions. Anybody in the audience who wants to ask?
Hi, Nimi. I don't want to
Hi.
ask. I want to just comment. Hi, Ankur. Good to
Hi.
hear. I'm so glad, the experience and the expertise comes from the volumes that you just shared, how simplistically you put things together. And, I went back to our memories in your house. I'm
Rima.
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Okay. Hi, Rima.
Yeah, in
Yeah.
fact, you quoted Nidhi Singhal. I was gone back to that era when I was doing my PhD. You were just almost about to complete, and Nidhi was also one step ahead of me, looking at how inclusion integration is being understood in the Indian context.
This is not that Nidhi, huh?
Acha, this Nidhi Singhal wasn't that?
No. This Nidhi Singhal is from Oxford University.
Yeah, she was the same. She was Nidhi Singhal from Oxford University, who was here to do data collection in St. Mary's.
Oh,
and she
was
looking,
that I don't know then. Oh,
yeah. Nidhi Singhal, in fact, she used to stay in Tilak Nagar and was doing from Oxford University, and presently now teaching there also.
Yes, that's right. Oh, okay, I didn't know that.
It's so good to hear, and how simplistically, and the way you reiterated, that's a continuous process, not something which is just done there, and how you could also relate to the nitty-gritties of, how conceptualization of inclusion and integration there is lack of clarity, not knowing which one to focus and excluding in the process of including. So I'm glad to hear. I had initially told Nimi that I may not be able to make it, but you're such a good speaker that I couldn't have missed it for something else.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rima,
I'm looking forward to
making
reconnect.
Yeah. Thank you for making it finally.
Yeah. Thanks, Nimi, for doing all such good
My
talks.
pleasure.
Looking forward to the series.
My pleasure. And a request to the audience, please fill the attendance and feedback form. It's very important for us. Your feedback is very important for us so that, we can improve on our initiatives. So please do not miss filling the feedback form. Thank you. Anyone else who would like to connect with Ankur? You have the opportunity. You can unmute yourselves and talk to her.
Good morning, everyone. I am Meeta from IP College. I was actually a little hesitant to interrupt. It was like interrupting the clergy. So, Ankur ma'am, thank you so much, for this wonderful talk. And actually, I had penned down 3 questions while you were delivering the talk. And to be very truthful, I had to cut down each one of them because you answered them while you were giving the session. So thank you so much on that. It was a very, very self-explanatory session. And one thing which, I always wonder and would like to share with everyone over here is that you talked about the role of a teacher, and how that becomes so pivotal and so important in actually transacting everything. Delivering everything which is there in the books and delivering to the students, and then, actualizing inclusion practice, and how bad teacher training programs are there in our country, in such a bad shape they are. Ma'am, I also feel that teachers are the ones actually who are the first level communication of the students. But when we talk about other stakeholders like, bureaucrats and IAS and collectors who are there in the policy making platforms, I don't know how much they are aware about this, because that even if you clear a mains exam and you clear an interview and you become a bureaucrat, you become an IAS officer, are you aware of these things? I mean, are you aware
Yeah.
of disabled population in your locality, in your community that you are heading? And then how does that seep down when it comes to a ground level? I mean, for example, an NGO worker who earns about 15,000 per month knows everything about disability, because that NGO worker is working very closely with the disabled population of the community. But anyone who is sitting at a higher level has actually no idea of what
Absolutely.
disabilities. So that always, shocks me. And
Agreed. And you're absolutely right. And what I want to say in response to that is also, that this hierarchy that exists in terms of intellectualizing things, right?
Yeah.
So in the sense that the intellectual voice is heard, but not that of the practitioner, right? So as an academic, I can write in all kinds of fancy journals and get published, and the bureaucrat may read what I am writing. But this NGO worker or the teacher on the ground who actually is dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, her voice is not heard anywhere, right?
Exactly.
And therefore, what we need to really, in teacher education programs, we can find lots and lots of things that are wrong with them. Certainly, one of the things that I really truly feel, and because now I work in, for so many years, I've been working in an education program, and we work intensively in teacher education. One of the areas I think that we really need to work on is preparing teachers to become researchers and scholars. They are not just there to disseminate whatever is written in textbooks and transfer it to children, but they should become scholars themselves. They should become researchers and also people who read and write. That's really important, because their voice is so important, but it just gets muffled in this, false kind of intellectualism that we create around this, right? So yes, I completely agree with you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
Thanks, Meeta, for joining in.
Thank you, ma'am.
Hello.
Yeah.
So I'm Pramila Zalpuri from Consortium for Inclusive Education, and we work from Vadodara.
Okay.
I'm really happy to see that people like Ankur, Madan and Meeta Virmani are working so much towards inclusive education. I'll just, if I can take a minute to share what we are doing.
Yes, please do.
We are trying to do all that work that y'all are defining that should be done. So one of the things we do is awareness and sensitization of all the stakeholders, be it the parents, be it the children, be it teachers, be it special educators, be it management of schools, because I feel that is, they require it. We also work on training teachers on how to deal with these kinds of disabilities. And as you said, teachers need to be able to work across disabilities. So if there's a child with hearing disability and with other disabilities, how do they handle? So we have, started working on teachers and training teachers on UDL principles. And we're trying to seek best practices of teachers from different schools, maybe all over the country. Our appeal is that if there are practices done on universal design of learning with children in the classroom sessions, especially primary classrooms, we deal with primary children, because I feel that is the first level at which primary or pre-primary and primary. So this is what we are doing. And we have been doing this for the last 4 years and very successful. I'm very thankful to Ms. Asha Singh, who shared this link with me about today's workshop. So through this workshop, I would like to say, Ankurji, you have given a beautiful session. And I feel that all the questions, the few questions that were asked, you have answered them perfectly to the dot.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to connect with you also, Pramila-ji. Yeah, Dr. Ashish Singh, in fact, yesterday wrote to me and told me about your group. And she was asking about UDL and if I knew any people who were practicing it, and I gave her one contact. So wonderful to connect with you. It'll be really lovely to hear more about the work that you do.
Absolutely. I will connect with you and all the people who are here today and appeal that please, if you want, I'll share our email ID with you.
Yeah, Pramila ji, thank you so much for joining in from Vadodara. And may I request you to just put your email ID in the chat box, because we would like to invite you to do a session for us in college.
Oh, sure.
Because as I mentioned earlier, we are planning to do a series, and we started with Ankur, and I would genuinely like you to do a session for us.
Yeah,
so
sure.
Kindly put the email ID on the chat box, please. Then I'll get in touch with you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nirmala ji.
Thank you, Pramila ji. Wonderful to have you on this session.
It was a pleasure from me too.
Yeah. If you can just, if once we have your email ID, then we'll keep sharing all our, session information with you so that you can join in, and we can invite you also to do a session for us.
Email. So that's all from me. I'm sharing my ID.
Thank you so much. We'll be in touch with you. We'll be in touch with you. Prerna, can you please make a note of the email ID, please?
Ma'am, I think Pramila ma'am has given it on your personal.
Okay.
Ma'am, can you send it on to JDM or Prerna Butta? I'll just take a note.
Okay, I'm just sharing it over here. I'm sharing it here with you.
Thank you.
I have also filled the attendance sheet, so you'll be able to get it from there.
Oh, yes, please do that.
Great.
Sure.
I've already filled it and it's there on, it's submitted.
Great. Thank you.
So happy to connect.
Nirmala, I would also like to share with you, perhaps if you have, the database of people who attended today's session about our diploma in inclusive education, because there seems to be a group of people who are so enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, if you have a poster or something, please share it with us.
I'll do
share
that.
It with me on my WhatsApp, and
I will do that.
Send it to all the students,
Yes,
and other groups.
It's actually, the program is meant for teachers, working people.
I think last year I got this poster from the LIC group, and I did share it with my students.
Yeah, it's actually meant only for people who are working, because it's meant for regular
not
teachers.
For students.
I mean, you should have some work experience. It's
and
not
what
meant
about
for students.
What about your postgraduate course?
Yeah, the postgraduate program, yes, I'll be very happy to talk about it. If you give me 2 minutes, I'll be very happy to talk about our Masters in Education program. Would like all of you to look at our website and find details of the program on it. This is a 2-year full-time Masters in Education program that prepares you to work in the domain of education, and comes with a very, very large kind of field experience that is provided through the field institutes that we work with in the foundation. And it's a mix of liberal theoretical program as well as lots and lots of practical knowledge in working in education. The program has now been running for more than 10 years, and we've got some I don't know, maybe 1,200 odd alumni who are working in different capacities in education. So and that program is of course available for all graduates, right? Any graduate.
Right. So in case you have a poster or something,
yeah,
absolutely.
I'll share it. It's on the website, everything, all the details, and the application is now open. So though the graduating batches can see if they are interested in
final
applying.
year students, I hope you're listening carefully to what Ankur ma'am is saying. Go to the Azim Premji website and look at the courses that are available for you and the courses that you can apply for.
Yeah. Okay. Please feel free. It'll be very nice to have some of you. We actually have a lot of students from Delhi every year. Lots of students, especially from BLEd programs, etc. So it'll be really good to have you all in Bangalore. And Bangalore is a great city to live in, and we have a beautiful campus. It'll be nice to have.
That's wonderful. Because they keep asking us in class, ma'am, what are the courses that we can, apply? And so girls, you heard it straight from the speaker that you can apply for the PG course and go through their website carefully. And I'm sure you'll find all the information there. In case there's something you need to ask, you can always ask me in class and I can verify it with Ankur ma'am. Okay? Yeah. And anyone else, any questions from the audience? Anybody who wants to connect, please do so. Unmute and anyone else?
Hi, good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
I'm Vidhi from GDMC, Janki Devi College. So I don't have a question exactly, but I just want to thank you for your beautiful session. So Nimla ma'am, before us in our class yesterday, even she told us, you have your session tomorrow, be on time. It's very important and it'll be a beautiful session for sure. And yes, she wasn't wrong. She's never wrong anyways. But it was a very beautiful session. And also thank you very much for informing us about your master's postgraduate course.
Thank you, Vidhi. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to students. I mean, I thrive on it. It's our bread and butter. So yes.
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Absolutely. So any more questions? Anyone from the audience?
And you guys should feel free to have a conversation. Okay. Don't feel inhibited about anything. Yeah. As students, we should have a more interactive, you should just speak your mind out, heart out. That's what students should be doing. Just say whatever comes to your mind. Don't hesitate.
I keep telling them in class, unless you interact, especially in this online mode, you just don't know whether they are listening and, it gets very difficult. So I keep telling them, please interact, please interact.
Yeah, absolutely. Should just speak your mind out. Don't hesitate.
Is there anyone else who would like to speak?
Yes, I would like to say something.
Yeah, sure.
Good morning, ma'am. I'm Ankur from Janki Devi Memorial College. First of all, thank you so much, ma'am, for today's session. It was really insightful. Also, ma'am, you have told various courses, postgraduate courses. So I would like to ask, what are the job opportunities in this field, ma'am?
Okay. See, the one that I have spoken about is the Masters in Education program. In addition to that, there is also a Masters in Development program. You can look that up also. So, the job opportunities are in the social sector. We have a university which is committed to working in the social sector. I don't know, because you're not Bangalore based, so you may or may not know very much about the foundation. The Azim Premji University is part of what is called the Azim Premji Foundation, which has been working in the space of school education, public school education now for about nearly 20 years. Okay. And it's very, very committed to improving the quality of school education in the country. And we have field institutes in 7 different states, some 55 districts, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now that's the foundation's work. Why I'm talking about the foundation is because from there, the genesis of the university happened. So job opportunities are in the social sector, which means organizations which work directly in education, which can be through CSR initiatives, or say, for example, an organization like Eklavya or Pratham. I don't know if you've heard of these organizations, I also or not, or Make My Dream or things like that, which work in the education sector. Now, what does that mean? Largely means that you could be involved in curriculum development, right? You could become a specialist, a curriculum specialist in a particular subject, By subject, I mean a school subject. So it could be, you could work in the curriculum and pedagogy of science or maths or language or social studies, or you could work in early childhood education, right? Those are the 5 broad subject areas in which you could work. You could also work with teachers in teacher education, right? So you could improve, enhance capabilities of teachers or in doing their job better. You can do work in this sector, that is inclusive education or disability sector. You can do program management, right? Those are the different ways in which people who become part of the education sector work. And the genesis of the university happened because we found that there is need for professionals to have a very, very strong understanding of this domain of education, right? And the domain here that I'm talking about is essentially school education, how to improve school education in our country. That's the objective, and that's where you also find the jobs. The placements are quite good. They are excellent. But remember, this is the social sector. So the imagination of the job should not be a cushy job in an air-conditioned office somewhere. We want our students to go out there and work in all kinds of remote parts of the country. And that is the reason why we offer scholarships, why we are very happy to have students from the remotest part of the country coming and studying with us and then going back and contributing back to where they belong. That's the idea that we have. That's what we want to do in the university, and we are being able to, I think, do that effectively also. But do not expect that your job will require you to sit for the rest of your life in an AC office. पर अगर आप जाके झारखंड में के किसी गांव में या छत्तीसगढ़ के किसी गांव में जाके काम करना चाहते हैं तो more than welcome. You are like really, really welcome. That's what we are looking for. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
Shikha, please ask your
Shikha.
question. Shikha, you've raised your hand.
Yes, ma'am. Am I audible?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Ma'am, it's Shikha this side. I'm from Institute of Home Economics. Firstly, I would say that it was quite an insightful session, and it was really, I have this year like a special education as my optional subject. So it was really helpful for me. Ma'am, the thing is, when we say that, we should include, or, we are trying to include, when we use this kind of a language, isn't it something that we are also labeling the people with disability as, that you don't belong here?
Yeah, absolutely.
So in those kind of terms, like whatever I have felt, like language based sensitization बहुत ज़्यादा ज़रूरी है.
बिल्कुल.
I have been in those situations where I have felt कि चाहे मैं ना भी चाहूँ, but unintentionally I don't have, those kind of words. लेकिन मतलब हो जाता है ऐसी तरीके से कि मैं चाहे कितना भी चाहूँ कि ना हो, पर मुझे पता ही नहीं कि उस बात को दूसरे तरीके से कहा कैसे जा सकता है. So I want to work on that. So as somebody said, like the institution is working on the, sensitization part and all of that. I want to know more about it. कि like हमारी language में obviously पहले हमारा thought change होना चाहिए, एक outlook change होना चाहिए. And when we be aware of that, so हम अपने words को लेके भी थोड़ा सा सोचते हैं फिर. But I want कि at least कुछ ऐसा हो कि जहाँ पे at least अपनी बात को दूसरी तरीके से रखने का एक तरीका पता हो. So is there anything that can help me with that?
See, Shikha, you're absolutely right. I completely agree with what you are saying कि हम बोलते हैं कि language से क्या फर्क पड़ता है, but actually बहुत फर्क पड़ता है. I completely agree with you. Even this whole idea of, for many years now, we've been using terms like Divyang and all of that to refer to people with disabilities. And the entire disabled community has raised its voice against it. वो बोलते हैं दिव्यांग का क्या मतलब है? We are normal, regular people. You don't have to put us up on a pedestal and treat us as divinity because we are not, and rightly so, right? So there is a lot in the use of terminology, patronizing की किसी को जरूरत नहीं है और होना भी नहीं चाहिए. The reason why we are not sensitive about language, okay, and I agree that we are not, is because of the fact that we have lived in an exclusive kind of society. हमारी society कभी भी normalize नहीं कर पाई इस चीज को, हम inclusive नहीं है, इसलिए हमारी language sensitive नहीं है. कि अगर it's like an imagination of, if I've always had a certain kind, if I've always had exposure of a certain kind, then I would not feel awkward about something like that. So what I'll give you an example of something that we do in our class, right? In the master's program, the elective that I teach, there we do one assignment in which I tell them to make friends with a person with disability. I just tell them that कहीं से भी ढूंढो, कुछ भी करके कोई एक बच्चा या अडल्ट ढूंढो जो कि जिनको डिसेबिलिटी है, and go spend time with them. And I cannot even tell you of the 45-50 odd students that I have, there is so much resistance. इतना resist करते हैं, क्लास में पूरा inclusion के बारे में बात करेंगे या कुछ करेंगे, but there is so much resistance to do this because it's that inhibition. Oh, how am I supposed to do this? And just like you talk to anybody, but you have to overcome these barriers for yourself first and reflect through the journey. And it's not about that person, it's about yourself. The exercise is a self-reflection exercise, that how do I feel when I'm with or around a person with disability, and what do I need to work on for myself. And I think it really begins there. It begins with your own self and then helping others to overcome it. And I agree with you that it leads to this sense of me doing something for the other. Who am I to decide whether I should include or not? Isn't it the decision of the person, right? And what am I including them into? Is it my society? Am I the owner of this? Is it not something that is supposed to be an equal space for everybody? So all of that comes from this exclusion that we have lived in and that we have created as our comfort zone. And it's not because we are bad people. ऐसा नहीं है कि हम inhuman है या हम बुरे हैं या कुछ है. It's just a discomfort that we've always held right from the beginning, and it's not easy to shed. There is nothing that you can say that this is a solution to it. This is what you can do today. It will happen when we make these shifts. I feel one of the ways in which it can happen is when you start having children with whatever diversity that you are looking at right from the start in your classroom. Kindergarten में अगर आपके आसपास बच्चे हैं जो आपसे अलग दिखते हैं, जो अलग behave करते हैं, children are the easiest. They are so malleable कि वो एक second में adapt कर लेते हैं. They will ask one question which may sound kind of insensitive, but then that's it, and you explain it to them and that's it. फिर वो खत्म हो जाता है उनका. They don't care after that. And that is where it begins. That is why schools have an important role to play in creating an inclusive and democratic society. That's where it should begin. But it has to, as adults, we have to work on it first for ourselves and then help others to do it, right?
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Okay. So, any other participant who has a question? Don't think so. Okay, participants, I have two requests to make. One is please fill up the feedback form. And secondly, can you all unmute your cameras for a group photograph so that we can document this session?
That is the hard one.
Yes, that is the hard one. Has to be done. Request everybody to please, let me unmute mine first before I say that to others. Why am I not able to unmute? Not able to unmute.
So are you all having online classes right now?
Yeah. For the last 2 years.
Oh, completely.
I think I have to join with my phone because I'm not able to
Oh, you're not able to. Oh,
yeah,
okay.
I don't know. There is some network issue. See, this is something that
Your
suddenly
video
happens.
shows it is on, but you're not visible.
I'm not able to join. I'm not able to unmute camera.
Ma'am, you can join from some other device.
I will, and I can't even exit.
Just a second.
I don't know how to exit also from here.
I'll just remove you and you can join with some
Yeah,
other.
I've joined from the phone.
Yeah, that's what's echoing now.
I'm just removing. Otherwise, it'll echo. Sorry about this, Ankur.
No, no worries. It's all right. Yeah. Yeah. Now we can see you, Nimi.
You can keep your mic mute till the time your photograph is being clicked. After that, you can just.
Ma'am, actually, Nirmala ma'am इस वाले frame में नहीं आ रहे हैं, but like if she can just say
No,
something
I
once.
can see her, so I'll.
Yeah,
just,
even I can see her. Yeah.
Just a second, I'll click the photograph. No issues. The other one. Done.
Thank you. And I'll now request Prerna from the HDFE department, faculty member, to propose the formal vote of thanks. Ankur.
Hello,
Prerna,
ma'am. Yeah. I hope I'm audible now.
Yeah.
Ma'am, on behalf of the Department of HDFE, Janki Devi Memorial College, I would like to thank you for doing this session for us. It was a very comprehensive session and you explained everything in such a clear and a simple manner. Sometimes we do, students definitely need those points, tuck, 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 and we know that this is the thing which comes under this particular topic. So you have done with that clarity, and I'm very sure the students would have, got a lot of information and insight about this particular topic. They definitely would have got some food for thought too. And I would like to thank you once again for taking out your time and doing this session for us. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and all your gracious comments and compliments. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to interact with all of you. And like I said earlier, that JDM is very, very special for me. It was my first job. So it seems millions of years ago, but still.
Thank you, Ankur. I can't thank you enough. I'm falling short of words. But it's been such a pleasure to see you, hear you, and
same here, Nimi.
Over the years, and doing us all proud. And
thank you so much.
I'm sure we can collaborate in the future too. Yeah. And really look forward to your presence in our other events as well. And yeah. Ankur, can I make a request? Can you share the PPT with me so that I can share it with my students?
Absolutely, sure. I'll just
Thank
do that.
you
I'll
so
send
much.
it to you by.
Thank you for your time and effort. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Good luck. Best wishes.
Bye. Take care. Bye-bye.